Sing for the blood of the crucified one, ransom from sin and a new world begun. Sing praise to the fathers and praise to the Son, saved by the blood of the crucified one. Save, save, save.
to 434. This is the prayer of those who are saved by the blood of Christ. Take my life, and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee.
Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. Take my hands and let them move at the impulse of thy will, at the impulse of thy love. Take my feet and let them be swift and beautiful for thee. Take my voice and let me sing, always only for thy King, always only for my King. Take my silver and my gold, not of my wood I withhold. Take my moments and my days, let them flow in ceaseless praise. Let them flow in ceaseless praise. Take my will and make it thine. It shall be no longer mine. Take my heart, it is thine own. It shall be thy royal throne. It shall be thy royal throne.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I think we will go out at the end of the night. We have Ray and Wenger with us tonight. And I think we're all familiar with Wengers. We don't have any visitors here tonight. So you all know that Wengers from North Carolina, and they've been visiting us at least once a year. Maybe we skipped a year, one out of the last 20 years. We're just blessed to have him here, and Ray has been on the road parts of each year for more than 20 years, you can say that. And we want to not take for granted tonight that that's a labor. It's a labor of love. It's a labor. 20 years ago when they traveled, they had 9 children with them, and they would sing for us. And Ray would preach and teach from the Word. And now they're just a beautiful couple with their daughter in town, and others scattered around from Nigeria to the Midwest and Southeast. So, Ray, would you come up and let's just pray for you before you share. And, hope you've done your homework, 1 Kings 1 to 11. And we'll glean some from God's Word tonight. Father, we thank you for the opportunity to sit and meditate on your Word, to glean from the studies that have been poured into, and to seek you, Father, to know you more deeply, to love you more completely, Lord, we ask you to give strength and energy to my brother Ray. We ask you to give him the clear, articulate lips and a keen and wise mind and a tender and listening heart. We ask you to indwell your people with your word and to cause us to be more fruitful, Father, out of a greater and deeper relationship with you. So bless my brother and bless our ears, hearts, and lives for your glory, Lord Jesus.
We're very glad to be here with you all again. It's a great privilege to meet with other people and consider the Word of God together. Tonight we're going to be looking at 1 Kings, glancing through 1 Kings chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so what that means is that we'll be referring to some verses, maybe reading some, and just pointing out some things as we go along. In these first two chapters, Solomon is getting established in his kingdom. And the chapter begins talking about King David in his old age. And it actually begins on a very sad note. You know, the Bathsheba event in David's life was a watershed in his life. He behaved very wisely before that event, but he deliberately plunged into sin, committed adultery, arranged for the murder of her husband, married her then afterwards and thought he had it all covered up. And then he reaped huge amounts of trouble for the rest of his life, even though God had forgiven him. It's very clear that God forgave him. It's very clear that David repented of his sins. But he made many, many wrong decisions after that, many, many wrong administrative choices. And here you have a picture of his decadence in a physical way. Verses 1 to 4, he was physically very feeble. He couldn't stay warm. And they put covers on him and he couldn't stay warm. So his servants gave him some advice. And you can see here that David is acting like a follower, not like a leader. The servants say, well, here's what we need. We'll hunt around and find a very beautiful virgin, and you can snuggle up to her, and that will help you get warm. Well, where was Bathsheba? Where was the other wives that he had? Maybe those other wives were dead, but Bathsheba was certainly alive. And so anyway, he relates to Abishag in a halfway manner, not fully as a wife. And clearly, she is viewed as part of the kingly harem because of what Adonijah tries to do when he schemes through Bathsheba to get Abishag for himself. That brings us to verse 5, and Adonijah decides to exalt himself to be king. And so he prepares for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. It's like as if he's already king and he's already grabbed the trappings of kingship. He does not wait for God's appointment. Saul was appointed king by God, and David waited for God's appointment. Now, why was Adonijah like this? Verse 6 tells us. It says, his father had not rebuked him at any time by saying, why have you done so? He was also very good looking. His mother had borne him after Absalom. So notice, David had never rebuked Adonijah in his whole life. Literally in Hebrew, it is, did not correct him from his days. In other words, even at the early stages in his life. And of course, the end result of this was Adonijah was used to getting his own way, and he'd like to be king. And so he was proceeding on that. Furthermore, he was very handsome, and handsome people have a great advantage over us ordinary folks. So, he was using all of his advantages. It may be that he was the oldest surviving son. We don't know for sure. Remember, Amnon was dead. He had been murdered by Absalom. Chileab There's no mention of him after his birth notation. Absalom is dead. He was executed by Joab with a dart through his heart. And then Adonijah was next. You can find that when you look at 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 2 to 5. So David never rebuked his current folly of parading as king. And by the way, that was contradicting his promise that he had made to Bathsheba years ago that Solomon, her son, would be king. So in other words, David is letting things go until events force him into action. Well, verses 7 and 8, there's some co-conspirators here. One of them is Joab. And this event here in 1 Kings chapter 1 helps explain Joab's life. You know, many times Joab did what was good for David and the kingdom. But his pattern is this. He did what he viewed as the most expedient thing for the advancement of his personal agenda. It wasn't that he was so concerned about God, and it wasn't he was so concerned about the kingdom, but he was concerned about Joab's advancement. And so sometimes this coincided with what God wanted, and sometimes it coincided with what God specified, but he was not particularly interested in following God. By the way, have you ever seen that theme enacted in life? It happens today too, where people are involved in the work of the church, but they may not really be so devout toward Christ. It's just that that's a framework in which they can push whatever agenda they want to push. Well, Joab was that kind of person. And then the other co-conspirator was Abiathar the priest. Verses 9 to 11, David is unaware that the kingdom is in danger. It's just like he doesn't know what's going on. David's circle was not invited to this. All the sons except Solomon were invited. And that suggests that Adonijah knew that Solomon was supposed to be the next king. Probably his brothers were invited so that they could relinquish any claim on the throne. And then verses 11 and following, Nathan is the one who actually is providing leadership for the kingdom. And so Nathan instructs Bathsheba what to do. Well, what happened was Bathsheba went in and started talking to David about his promise of earlier time. And then while she is talking, Nathan comes in and confirms her words. And so disaster is barely averted. Just almost had an absolute crisis there. And so they make moves to actually anoint Solomon king, like was supposed to happen. And if you get down to verse 49, you find that all of a sudden Adonijah's guests decided it's better to go somewhere else. You know, we don't want to be here at this thing. We're going to get out of here before we have a big problem. They did not want to be connected with this conspiracy. So Adonijah, verse 50, was afraid of Solomon. So he arose and took hold of the horns of the altar. The altar was a place of sanctuary, and ordinarily a person could not be killed if they were holding on to the horns of the altar. So he goes there, hangs on to the horns, and Solomon hears about it. And so Solomon was told, verse 51, Adonijah is afraid of King Solomon, for look, he has taken hold of the horns of the altar, saying, let King Solomon swear to me that he will not put his servant to death with the sword. And Solomon gave a very wise answer. He said, if he proves himself a worthy man, not one hair of him shall fall to the earth, but if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. So King Solomon sent, brought him down from the altar, and fell down before Solomon, and Solomon said, go to your house. It's very likely that Adonijah expected to be executed as a rival, which probably is what he would have done, because you remember when Bathsheba came in and requested David to deal with this, she said, if Adonijah becomes king, Solomon and I will be regarded as transgressors. And so this thing of him being a worthy man and having reprieve because of it, in other words, worthy man is to renounce all claims to the throne. That brings us to chapter 2. Well, the days came when David drew near to dying, and so he gives a charge to his son Solomon and says, I go the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and prove yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn, that the Lord may fulfill his word which he spoken concerning me. Now notice, you obey so that you may prosper and the Lord may fulfill his word. It's not that God had made a promise and it's going to automatically be fulfilled regardless of what you do. And then he says, if your sons take heed to their way to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul, he said, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. Now I think it's instructive to look in the book of 1 Chronicles and you see more of what David had to say. In fact, 1 Chronicles 28 verse 9 has an ominous statement in it. And it shows that David did not view God's promise to him as an unconditional promise for his son. He says, verse 9, as for you, my son Solomon, know the God of your father and serve him with a loyal heart and with a willing mind, for the Lord searches all hearts and understands all the intent of the thoughts. If you seek him, he will be found by you, but if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. Very interesting statement in light of what we know about Solomon later on. But then what David does, he pushes off unfinished business onto Solomon. Verse 5 and 6, he asks Solomon to execute Joab. Moreover, you know what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me, and what he did to the two commanders of the armies of Israel, to Abner the son of Ner, and Amasa the son of Jether, whom he killed. And he shed the blood of war in peacetime, and put the blood of war on his belt that was around his waist, and on his sandals that were on his feet. Therefore do according to your wisdom, and do not let his gray hair go down to the grave in peace. Now, notice Joab's character. In general, he's been loyal to King David, and often he did what was best for the kingdom. He had spiritual insight in opposing the census that David wanted to do, and it cost the lives of so many people. But he forced David's hand in assassinating Abner and Amasa, and he disobeyed explicit instructions to not kill Absalom. Joab used those situations to advance his own agenda. In addition, Joab demonstrated his public support of a rival to young Solomon on the throne. In other words, Joab will stoop to any ends to achieve his own agenda. And so he's dangerous as a traitor. And David refers to Joab's treachery in the past. Now, David should have dealt with it. When Joab murdered Abner, David should have had, according to the law, Joab executed. And when Joab murdered Amasa, he should have been executed also. Now, it makes you wonder if one of the reasons David didn't do that in the second case with Amasa is what about his own sin in arranging for the murder of Uriah? You know, one of the things that's a problem with sin is if we indulge in sin, then it makes us difficult for us to deal with sin when we're supposed to. And David's life certainly illustrates that. Verse 7, David also says, give kindness to the sons of Barzillai. Now, these people helped David out when he fled from Absalom, his brother. From Absalom, Solomon's brother. Obviously, it's appropriate for kindness to continue to a family because of that, but it seems very inappropriate to have Solomon to put these people on the public dole because of something they did way back then. I mean, why couldn't they have an opportunity to serve in the kingdom, not just because you're going to feed them now for the rest of their lives because of this? And then, verses 8 and 9, we have something else. David asks Solomon to execute Shimei in a wise way. He says, you have here with you Shimei, the son of Gera, a Benjamite from Bahurim, who cursed me with a malicious curse in the day when I went to Mahanaim. But he came down to meet me at the Jordan, and I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death with the sword. Now, therefore, do not hold him guiltless, for you are a wise man and know what you ought to do to him, but bring his gray hair down to the grave with blood. Now, wait a minute. Something is going wrong here. Because when that happened, one of David's men said, let me go over there and knock his head off. And David said, no, God has sent him to curse. And then he swore to Shimei that he would not execute him. And at one point in some of these discussions, something was said, and David said, am I not now king in Israel? In other words, I'm king, so I can do what I please. You know what? As king, he could not just do what he pleased. He was obligated to do God's will. And there was a statement in the law, it was against the law to curse the ruler of God's people. You can read about it in Exodus 22, verse 28, and compare 2 Samuel 16, 9 to 13, where Shimei was doing this. And so now, David is telling Solomon, you deal with this. Something that David should have dealt with years ago. David shouldn't have made that vow. Now, why was David so pitiful at age 70? Well, this sin with Bathsheba was a watershed. He made many bad decisions, and when you make bad decisions, some of them were morally wrong and some were administratively wrong, but when you do either one of those, you create a bigger platform for more kinds of pressure. And that certainly happened in David's life. But at the same time, we remember that David's influence for good continued through the centuries. In other words, God did not write him off, and God didn't say, you're done, finished. His standard for good was a standard for succeeding kings. In fact, the author of the book of Kings says David faithfully walked with God except for the case of Uriah the Hittite. And so David did what was right, but then he failed terribly, sinned deeply, and that sin had ramifications in his life and the life of his family. And in a sense, David was a defender of Jerusalem for centuries because God spared Jerusalem for his sake. So because he lived righteously, God spared Jerusalem, even though many times the kings or the inhabitants were not living righteously. So, chapter 2, verses 10 through 46, we have Solomon's kingdom firmly established. Notice that in verses 10 to 12, he is established on the throne before David's death. And then we have the final episode with Adonijah, verses 13 to 25. And so Adonijah comes sneaking into Bathsheba to obtain Abishag. In other words, Adonijah has the idea that the kingdom really belongs to me. But yet, he refers to it as being changed to Solomon because of the Lord. In other words, he recognizes that God had ordained for Solomon to have the kingdom, but he thinks he would still like to have it and he would like to get it. And so, he wants Bathsheba to go to Solomon to gain a favor. And you see, the deal is that getting Abishag would give him a claim to the kingdom. Now, if you remember, 2 Samuel 12, verse 8, God stated that he had given to David Saul's wives into your bosom. That's chapter 12, verse 8. In other words, the kingdom had been transferred from Saul, who was dead, to David. And then Absalom, remember, in 2 Samuel 16, publicly went into David's concubines as an assertion of his becoming king in his stead. You might also like to glance at 2 Samuel 3, verses 7 and 8. There was a dispute of Ishbosheth regarding Abner and Saul's concubine. So you can see all of this was tied up with a threat to power. Now notice Solomon's wisdom here. Bathsheba, as the queen of David, she knew things that would go on in court. And I think she was pretty shrewd, and she knew how to expose Adonijah's treachery. And so what she does, she says, okay, I'll go talk to Solomon. And she conveys Adonijah's request. And no surprise, Solomon saw through the whole thing. And he refused to carry it out because he knew the folly of it. In other words, Adonijah is still scheming to get the kingdom. So you see, he's not living as a worthy man at all. In fact, it's quite interesting. Adonijah the schemer dies for his own foolishness, and Solomon wisely follows the advice of others and becomes king. So he is executed. And then verse 26 and 27, he removes Abiathar, the co-conspirator from the priesthood, right on the heels of getting rid of Adonijah. And he executed Joab, verse 28 to 35. And Joab made it as hard as he could for him. He went in and held on to the horns of the altar. And so Benaiah came back and he said, "There's Joab." And Solomon said, "Go get him and kill him right there." And then with Shimei, verse 36 to 46. He placed Shimei under a curfew. He called for Shimei, verse 36, and said to him, "Build yourself a house in Jerusalem and dwell there, and do not go out from there anywhere. For it shall be on the day you go out and cross the brook Kidron, know for certain you shall surely die, your blood shall be on your own head." And Shimei said to the king, "The saying is good. As my lord the king has said, so your servant will do." So Shimei dwelt in Jerusalem many days. Now it happened at the end of 3 years that 2 slaves of Shimei ran away to Achish, the son of Maacah, the king of Gath. And they told Shimei, saying, "Go, look, your slaves are in Gath." So Shimei arose, saddled his donkey, went to Achish at Gath to seek his slaves. And Shimei went and brought his slaves from Gath. And Solomon was told that Shimei had gone from Jerusalem to Gath and had come back. Then the king sent and called for Shimei and said to him, "Did I not make you swear by the Lord and warn you, saying, know for certain that on the day you go out and travel anywhere, you shall surely die? And you said to me, the word I have heard is good. Why then have you not kept the oath of the Lord and commanded I gave you?" The king said moreover to Shimei, "You know, as your heart acknowledges all the wickedness that you did to my father David, therefore the Lord will return your wickedness on your own head. But King Solomon shall be blessed, and the throne of David shall be established before the Lord forever." Now notice, what Solomon did was place Shimei under curfew. He couldn't go anywhere out of Jerusalem, and he couldn't cross Kidron. In other words, he wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to be able to go stir up trouble with the Benjamites. And Shimei agreed it was good. But Shimei heard that his slaves had fled away to Gath, and so he foolishly travels 25 miles to Gath to capture them, and he captures them. He broke his promise to the king. And so David's old curser has brought a curse on himself. And at the confrontation, Solomon reminds Shimei of all the wickedness he did to David. Now notice what happened here. Solomon had a very hard job. He's a young king. He's just starting out. He's new in the kingdom. And you can expect when somebody comes in new in the kingdom, in other words, the new ruler, there are going to be people who would test him to see if he has resolve. And David left Solomon with some very hard problems. I mean, Joab was a very powerful man. He would have had lots of powerful friends. And he made his execution as difficult as possible for Solomon. Adonijah, obviously, had a strong faction of influential people. And David's refusal to nip those aspirations in the bud left a complicated and dangerous mess for Solomon. And Shimei would have had sympathizers among the Benjamites. But how he dealt with it shows his wisdom as a young man. And notice, this is even before God answered his request for wisdom. And by the way, that shows his humility in asking. Because when he had that dream, we're going to look at that a little later, he still asked for wisdom. He didn't think, well, I sure did good on these hard jobs. I'll be able to handle anything. That brings us to chapter 3. Chapter 3, verses 1 to 3, we see some flaws in his personal affairs. Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. Then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall all around Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the people sacrificed at the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. Now, one thing that's quite shocking is that verse 1, before he ascended the throne, he had already married somebody. We don't see that from verse 1 specifically, but if we glance at 1 Kings 14, verse 21, and compare it with chapter 11, verse 42 and 43, you find that his son, if you read the chronology, you find that Solomon reigned for 40 years. And you find that Rehoboam, his son, was 41 years old when he began to reign. And Rehoboam was the son of Naamah the Ammonitess. Now, I don't have any information about why Solomon married an Ammonite woman. Why did David arrange for that kind of marriage? Or did Solomon just decide that's what I want to do? I don't know. But there's something amiss. It sounds amiss. There's no comment made about it. But his first wife was an Ammonitess. Now, his marriage to Pharaoh's daughter, marriage to an Egyptian, was not specifically forbidden in the Mosaic law. But what was forbidden was marriage to foreign women, Canaanites particularly, unbelievers. And apparently it was permissible to take a woman as a wife if she was taken in war, but only if she renounced her idolatry and followed the Lord would such marriage be within the spirit of the law. So it seems like that there was no idolatry with Pharaoh's daughter. There's no trace of Egyptian idolatry in Israel during the Solomonic era. And she is explicitly distinguished from the other foreign wives who turned his heart away in 1 Kings chapter 11. Now we know this was a political marriage. If you read it literally in Hebrew, it reads like this: Solomon became Pharaoh's son-in-law. In other words, the focus of the text is not his marriage to the daughter of Pharaoh as a wife as much as it's a focus on making a treaty with Pharaoh. You see, one of the things that these ancient kings did was they would marry a daughter of this other kingdom. So then the father-in-law would not be so inclined to go to war against your kingdom because it would be going against your own daughter. So whatever happens, there's evidence of trusting more in human mechanisms than in God himself. Now, it shows the importance of the Davidic kingdom and the weakness of Egypt at this time, because former pharaohs refused to give daughters even to important kings. And this Pharaoh gave his daughter, and he gave Getzer as a wedding present. And so Pharaoh got some trade routes, and Solomon got a secure border on the south. So, there you have something else going on, a political marriage that certainly suggests not a complete trust in the Lord and in trusting in human schemes instead. And then you have his religious affairs, verses 2 and 3. Both he and the people sacrificed on the high places. The temple wasn't yet built. Now, these high places were not used for the worship of other false gods, but for the Lord. But still, it was contrary to the law. And the wording indicates that this was an issue that needed correction, and God's prophets often spoke against it. What it did was it detracted from the central worship of God at the central sanctuary that God had ordained. And so then you have the temptation of sort of combining other things from these other deities and so on. What we have is a historical background of confusion regarding the central worship place. You remember the tabernacle was first at what town when they came into the land? Anyone remember? Where was the tabernacle at first? At first, it was at a place called Shiloh. But when the Philistines captured the ark in Eli's day, that place lost its significance as the place where God met with his people. And so for years, the returned ark remained at Abinadab's house, according to 1 Samuel 7. until David decided to move it to Jerusalem, 2 Samuel 6. And the tabernacle also appears at a town called Nob in 1 Samuel 21, and was there until Saul murdered the priests, 1 Samuel 22. And later it was moved to Gibeon and connected with the ministry of Zadok, 1 Chronicles 16:39-40. And so during the reign of David, you have two tabernacles. There's one at Gibeon, and its points in its favor were, it was the original tabernacle which Moses had made, and the bronze altar that had been made by Bezalel, the grandson of Hur, was also there. So that's two big points in favor. The thing against it was the ark wasn't there. Then there was another tabernacle at Jerusalem. Its strong point was that's where the ark was, and its failing point was it wasn't the original tabernacle, but one that David had erected. So you see, you've got two competing tabernacles. One has one advantage, one has another advantage. Well, which one is the most important advantage? Which one do we go to? Do we go to the nearest one or the farthest one? Or the one we think is most important this year and the one we think is less important next year? Or how do you do that? And that corresponds to the double priesthood of Zadok and Abiathar. So the central sanctuary is in limbo. And so even godly people worshiped at high places. Samuel, for example, worshiped at high places, which was allowed if it wasn't associated with Canaanite worship. Now, what does this tell us? You know, if we have a wrong action that we take, many years later, it might have continuing bad effects. So Eli's failure in the family institutionalized terrible failure in his sons with how they treated the women at the tabernacle door and how they dealt with the sacrifices. And then when the ark was returned, it wasn't placed back in the Mosaic tabernacle. And David used a Philistine method to return the ark. And so he was upset when Uzzah got killed. But he did some research and found out, we didn't do it the right way. So then he had Levites haul it on poles, and they went with rejoicing to Jerusalem. But the end result is you have two competing places of worship. So you see these two competing places of worship sort of set the stage, as it were, for more than two competing places of worship. But anyway, Solomon did follow the statutes of David, his father. In chapter 3, we also have the thing of Solomon asking for wisdom. Verse 4, it says, the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was a great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. And you remember, Gibeon was the place where the original bronze altar was. And he met God at the high place of Gibeon. It says that the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, ask, what shall I give you? And Solomon said, you have shown great mercy to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in truth, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart with you. You have continued this great kindness for him, and you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? Now, look at this. Solomon was having a dream. And in the dream, he dreamed that God was asking him, what would you like to have? I'll give it to you. And so Solomon in a dream says, I want wisdom to make judicial judgments for this people. Now, how would you like it if God judged you by your request in a dream? You know, it does give you a hint of Solomon's attitude. And he requested wisdom, and literally it says his request was, give me a hearing heart. You know, I like that expression. I wish they'd have translated it literally, because isn't that what we need more of in terms of our attitude toward God? See, he wasn't saying, just give me wisdom, but give me a hearing heart. That's what we really need in terms of hearing what God says and applying it. And so give me a hearing heart to judge your people. In other words, to properly evaluate the case. Now, he is not asking specifically for philosophical or scientific wisdom. He's not asking for knowledge of botany or biology or astronomy. He's asking for judicial wisdom in terms of dealing with court cases. And notice he made this request while he's dreaming. And what did God do? God promised him wisdom that surpassed all who were before him and after him. Verse 12. Because you have asked this thing, and not asked for long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have you asked life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice. You see, that tells you the focus there. Understanding to discern justice. Behold, verse 12, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall be not anyone like you among the kings all your days. So if you walk in my ways to keep my statutes and my judgments, my commandments rather, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. Now notice, the wisdom that he gave was to surpass all before and after him. So he gave wisdom far beyond his request for skill in ruling. It was comprehensive and vast in understanding. You read about it in chapter 4. He's wiser than some of the famous men. He wrote 3,000 proverbs and 1,000 songs. And he was recognized and sought by foreign countries for his wisdom. And he had riches and honor, so none would compare with him during his lifetime. Verse 13. Now notice, this comparison is less exhaustive. You see, wisdom greater than before or after, and riches and honor greater than all in his lifetime. That shows you some of God's priorities. By the way, it corresponds to some other things that we tend to worry about. Take no anxious thought for what you shall eat or what you shall drink, because God knows you have need of all these things. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. You see the thing that's going on there? And notice it's conditional. If he walks in God's ways like David failed miserably at that one major point in his life that we can see, and yet he repented. And the end of his life was that he was still following God. But you know, Solomon did not fulfill that. He did not live a long life. He reigned for about 40 years. We don't know exactly when he started reigning, but there's some people that have thought that he probably began reigning when he was about 20. Anyway, verse 15, Solomon awoke and it was a dream. So he went to Jerusalem and offered there. And there was confirmation of this conditional covenant that God had made with him. He stood up there and offered up burnt offerings, peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. Now, verse 16 and following, Solomon's wisdom is confirmed by an amazing account. 2 women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. And one woman said, "Oh, my lord, this woman and I dwell in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house. Then it happened the 3rd day after I had given birth that this woman also gave birth, and we were together. No one was with us in the house except the 2 of us in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. So she arose in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while your maidservant slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead child in my bosom. And when I arose in the morning to nurse my son, there he was, dead. But when I examined him in the morning, indeed it was not my son whom I had born." Then the other woman said, "No, but the living one is my son, the dead one is your son." And the first woman said, "No, but the dead one is your son, and the living one is my son." Now notice what you have here. You have no witnesses and equal claims. So you can't go to somebody and say, okay, you have just 2 people making equal claims, and there's no possibility of other witnesses. So, Solomon exhibits a deep insight into human nature. He says, "Bring me a sword." So they brought him a sword. And the king said, "Divide the living child in 2 and give half to one and half to the other." Then the woman whose son was living spoke to the king, for she yearned with compassion for her son. And she said, "Oh, my lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him." But the other said, "Let him be neither mine nor yours, but divide him." So the king answered and said, "Give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill him. She is his mother." And all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had rendered, and they feared the king because they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. You see, by making that statement, Solomon was able to get the attitude and heart of both of those women unveiled in court, obvious for everyone to see, and everyone knew who the mother was. Amazing. A bold exposure of fraud and a just verdict. Now, what this means, Solomon can give this kind of verdict on this kind of hard case. What would happen? People who were con men and people who were frauds would be afraid to have their case go clear up to Solomon. They'd want to settle at a lower court. You see, it says there, the people feared from the face of the king. In other words, they did not want to come into his presence for a court case, unless, of course, you were on the right side. Chapter 4. Here we see Solomon's administration. And he lists his major officials in verses 1 to 6. And then he lists 12 governors to provide for Solomon each month, verse 7. And in verses 8 through 19, he lists where they are. And if you read down through that list, you'll find that that list does not correspond to tribal boundaries. And it doesn't even seem that Judah is really represented there. And so what does he do? He is collecting taxes to support this central government, but not always following tribal boundaries. Now that's a radical approach. You see what he's doing? He is operationally abolishing the political significance of the tribal system. Uh-oh. Who instituted the tribal system? Very obvious who did. God. And you've got this new heavy tax burden instead of the 12 tribes supporting the central priesthood as God had directed. 12 districts support Solomon's court. Now, of course, you have new costs here. Remember, God said, don't you take a king. Don't do it. He spoke through Samuel. The people had come and they said, we want to be like the nations. We want to have a king like the nations so he can go out in front of us and fight our battles. You know why they said that? Because they were tired of having God as king. Why were they tired of having God as king? Can God fight battles pretty good? Obviously he can. He took the wheels off the chariots that were coming after him through the Red Sea, didn't he? And I like the way the phrase runs there. It says, and they drove with difficulty. And he was able to defeat multitudes of armies in various kinds of ways, in amazing ways. And they said, we don't want him as king. We want a human king to fight our battles. Why do they want a human king to fight their battles? Because if they refused to obey God, God would not only fight he wouldn't fight their battles for him, he would bring a foreign nation in and smash them. And we're tired of this. We want to live like we please and then be able to win our battles. So, give us a king, he can lead us out, he can set up an ambush, he can arrange all this stuff, and we can win our battles without being obedient to God. By the way, does that sound familiar? A lot of people want to set up mechanisms in the church so that they can make their church prosper even if they don't obey God. It's the same kind of attitude. So, God said, I'm warning you, you have a king like this, he will take your best fields, take them for himself. He'll take your sons and your daughters and put him busy doing their work, his work. He'll take this and he'll take that. And when you cry out in that day, I'm not going to listen to you. You see, when you look at the life of Solomon, we have an illustration of this exact thing. Solomon was king, and he had a huge harem, lots of women. And he had chariots and horses, and he had an army. And he had a growing population to administrate. You know, a government just slurps up more administrators to manage more and more managers, which manage more and more managers and manage more and more people. And so it takes money to feed them and to clothe them and to take care of their families, etc., etc., etc. Well, you have some prosperity. Verse 20, Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and rejoicing. So Solomon reigned over all kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Now Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fatted oxen, 20 oxen from the pastures. Look at that. They even had grain-fed oxen and grass-fed oxen. And 100 sheep besides deer, gazelles. They had wild animals too. You have your pick here of natural versus domesticated, pen-fed or whatever. Roebucks and fatted fowl. For he had dominion over all the region on this side of the river from Tiphsah even to Gaza, namely over all the kings on this side of the river, and he had peace on every side all around him. And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, each man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan as far as Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. Now, let me show you a little chiasm here. Verse 20, Judah and Israel were eating and drinking and rejoicing. And then down in verse 25, Judah and Israel dwell safely, each man under his own vine, his own fig tree. So you see it's talking about a very similar thing. Come down from the top, verse 21, Solomon reigned over all these other kingdoms who brought him tribute. Come up from the bottom, verse 24, Solomon reigned over these other kingdoms without rebellion. And right in the middle, verse 22 and 23, is the provisions that Solomon was absorbing at his household, at his table. His provision for grain, verse 22, and his provision for meat, verse 23. Now, this time of prosperity, countries under tribute would commonly rebel when the old king died. And so then the new king would need to prove his ability to enforce the agreement. But Solomon didn't need to do this because God had given him peace. And that gave him time to build and administrate and trade and pursue wisdom. But what did he do with his time? We know that he squandered it with his lust for women, his lust for horses, and his lust for gold. And the focal center here, like I mentioned, the center of this chiasm is the extent of the food that he was absorbing. We put it in modern terms so we can get a grasp of what this is. The fine flour was, for each day, was between 150 and 280 bushels. The coarse flour was 300 to 560 bushels. So that could produce probably about 28,000 pounds of bread, which would be sufficient for maybe 14,000 people if each person got 2 pounds a day. And or some other estimates might say 4,000 or 5,000 people. It's hard to know how to make guesses on these kind of things. But anyway, and then meat, beef. A modern beef, when they're butchered, might have 500 pounds per carcass of meat. But let's just assume the cattle weren't as big back then. I don't know if they were or not, but let's just assume 300 pounds. Well, 30 oxen would be 9,000 pounds of meat per day just for the oxen. And other meat was 100 sheep and wild animals and fattened birds. So it's certainly not unreasonable to think of somewhere between 10 and 15,000 pounds of meat per day. I mean, just imagine that. So estimates of how many people he was feeding maybe would run somewhere between 14,000 to 32,000. You know, we just don't really know. But this huge amount of food, and I think it's good when you come to things like this, if your translation says so many cores, K-O-R-S, that's what New King James says, of fine flour, it's a good idea to look at a footnote somewhere and find out, how much stuff was that anyway. Then verses 26 to 28, the provision for horses. Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. And these governors, each man in his month, provided food for King Solomon for all who came to King Solomon's table. There was no lack in their supply. They also brought barley and straw to the proper place for the horses and steeds, each man according to his charge. I mean, look at that. You remember back in the law, it said, if somebody becomes king in Israel, he shall not multiply horses to himself, not multiply gold to himself, not multiply wives to himself. Here you see the seeds of disaster that Solomon is sowing in his life. Now, how does this happen? I suspect that Solomon thought, well, I can do a little of this, and it won't affect me. I'm wise. I have wisdom from God. So I won't turn away from God. You know, I know that the law says this, but, I'm not going to do that. I've already decided that. I'm not going to let that happen. Supernatural wisdom he did have. Verse 29 to 34. God kept his promise. God gave him wisdom and exceedingly great understanding and largeness of heart like the sand on the seashore. Thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all men from Ethan the Ezrahite and Heman, Chalcol and Darda, the sons of Mahol. And his fame was in all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs. By the way, if you think that didn't amount to much, I challenge you to write 10 proverbs that are really excellent. It's not an easy job. 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He also spoke of trees, from the cedar tree of Lebanon even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He spoke also of animals, of birds, of creeping things, and of fish. And men of all nations from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Now notice that God gave him this wonderful wisdom, even though Solomon was already abusing his privileges. He was living extravagantly. He was working the Israelites hard. And as the monarchy increases, more excesses. Saul, in between military campaigns, what was he doing? He was out with the herd. David had a king's house and also had some forced labor. And Solomon takes it even further. He did have a breadth of wisdom. He had wisdom on many subjects. And he was the author of songs. The Song of Solomon, for example, he was the author of 2 psalms in Scripture, Psalm 72 and Psalm 127. Did you ever know that psalm about arrows in the hand of a warrior? That was a psalm of Solomon. Now, there are 2 possible impressions when we read chapter 3 and 4. The positive is there's good regarding the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham and David. And the negative is something uneasy is going on here. Warnings against wealthy kings by Moses and by Samuel. Solomon's activities. Compare that with Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 13 to 17. Woe is the man whose enjoyments are based on his neighbor's service for nothing. Solomon got many enjoyments based on the fact that he was king and he could do whatever he pleased. And what these early chapters in 1 Kings show us is how things that may not have seemed too serious in themselves set the stage for long-term disasters in the years that follow. I believe it's so important that we guard our hearts. We live in a day of huge distractions. And it's so easy to be distracted not only by bad things, but by things that are not bad in themselves or even by things that are good in themselves. It's so easy to do that. And miss out in having an appetite for the best things. So for tomorrow, study chapter 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm not quite sure how far I'm going to get tomorrow, but I intend to get through chapter 11 by Friday night. So you can sort of read ahead a little bit. Does anyone have any observations or comments you would like to make or questions? Okay, Lord bless you.
True, I always agree that much of life is in the margin. There's things you do a little bit this way, a little bit this way. That we think, we can say that and acknowledge that the devil is changes our thinking in ways that we kind of go along with for a ride. And it's unfortunate sometimes, just it's too late by the time we realize it. And so much of life is in the margin, it's recognizing that shift, that slant one way or the other, that I'm leaning towards being desperate for God's word, being desperate for his leading, or I'm leaning towards being sloppy or being, allowing myself to knowingly doing something that is contrary to what is going to be helpful in my walk. And because we're vulnerable. So I gleaned some lessons tonight from these chapters about that need. If your weight, your inertia in one way, people, with baseball season, we get the playoffs, and following it a little bit. If you're on first base and you're taking the lead because you want to get a jump to get to second, the ball's hit, and then you think you're scoring, and the runner has to put their balance right in the middle so that if the pitcher throws the ball to the first baseman, he can bypass the pitch. But he doesn't want to be shifted this way either, because then he's going to have to shift his weight that way to get ready to get running to the ball's hit. And that's what we have to do in our own lives. We have to make sure that we are leaning, which way we want to go, ultimately, and keep our lean in that direction. So, thank you, Lord, for your word. We rise in the closing prayer. Lord, we thank you for your word, your precious word, which is the light to our path, the lamp to our feet, which instructs us, which reveals you